Alright, we did it. We made it through World War II. We are on the last section of the war, or the home front. In this video, we're going to look at two things in particular. One, what are the major economic and social changes that happened as a result of the war? And then what was the purpose of Japanese internment? So, let's start out economically. Once America entered the war, unemployment reached 1.2%, which was unseen of for more than 15 years. If you remember your Great Depression quiz and you look at that graph of unemployment, it was close to 20 to 30%. Now it's at 1.2%. The average wages, in addition, rose more than 10%. So not only is virtually every person who wants a job back to work, but they're also making more money. This in particularly affected farmers because their income drastically increased as crop production rose, as they needed more crops for soldiers and to export to other countries. Their income tripled, which allowed many of them to pay off their mortgages. In doing so, they prevent the same problems that they would face after World War I. So instead of being in super high debt with high mortgages, they leave unscathed after the war. In addition, because of this, 6 million women entered the workforce for the first time ever. Now, as a whole, 30%, 35% women worked outside the house. So, 1 in 3 women have a job outside the house. And more are looking towards skilled industries than ever before. So more than just, watching kids or cooking for families or being a secretary. They're actually skilled jobs like you see here. This lady's working on a telephone parts, it looks like. A job that is skilled. If you look at this graph here, this is personal savings. I know it's hard to see from 1929 to 06. Here's during the Great Depression, personal savings actually declined. And then during World War II in this area, it skyrocketed in the highest rate ever. So at this time, people are making more, they're back to work, and they're saving more than ever before. So, what's going on socially? You have a huge shift in population. Just like what happened after World War I with the Great Migration, you're having a very similar migration. This was actually one of the largest migrations in U.S. history. More than 1 million people moved to California in particular, and African Americans by the droves left the South for cities in the North. The most went to the Midwest here. That's where you see like cities like Detroit here. Really skyrocket with the number of people and workers, and that's why it becomes the automobile industry, but also all around the country. In addition, not only are African Americans moving out of the South for jobs in the North, but you have men at war, women at work, and more people relied then on childcare. So it's becoming a bigger deal now or I should say actually less of a deal to send your children off to childcare. Before it was something that few families do, now it's very common. And as a result, this is also when teenagers are starting to be left alone for the first time, where the teenage years are starting to develop, where you typically get into trouble. This all happens as a result of the war. The war also created new families faster than ever before. You have a lot of people who didn't get married or have kids because of the Depression. They couldn't afford to get married or to have kids. And because of the war, longtime sweethearts get married before they're going to the war, or couples that are still back at home are finally having kids. And this will skyrocket as the war ends and we get the baby boom and the biggest population growth in American history. One of the biggest things that helps create social change is this GI Bill of Rights, excuse me. And what it does is to ease the tensions of GIs returning home. Congress passed this bill in 1944, and the idea is Congress isn't stupid. They know that after World War I, a series of problems happened, which led to unemployment, bad savings practices, and then that led to the Great Depression. The idea is this is one thing that can help prevent these problems so the U.S. and then the world isn't in another depression. And one of the things they did is they provided education, free college to anyone who wanted it, or training to GIs once they returned back home. So if you wanted to go to college or you wanted to become an electrician and you needed this special training, you could get it for free. In addition, they offered very, very cheap loans to buy homes, And as a result, about half, or 7.8 million, of the GIs took advantage of this bill in some way or another. So it's really advantageous to American families at this time. With all these change comes a negative change as well, and you start to see discrimination and civil rights on the rise. As many African Americans moved from the South to the Midwest, uh, they started to seek more skilled jobs, and the actual rate of African Americans that were in skill or semi-skilled jobs doubled to 30%. So you have that great backdrop there. You have them moving out of the South in huge numbers. You have them taking, or getting jobs in these cities in the West and in the North. But they faced huge discrimination, and that's why CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality, was established. And the idea was that if you try and confront urban segregation, where primarily African Americans are living in the North, then you may be able to improve this situation. And so African Americans were first needed to fill the jobs. And so during the war, there was some discrimination, but by and large, the workers really needed them to work, and so they hired them. But then as GIs started to come back, you see a lot of discrimination, protests, and violence. And actually, some of the worst violence happened in Detroit, for example, where there's a ton of industry. And this is a picture here of the violence between the races. You see the African American man here being beaten by a series of white workers around them, and it was bad. And in fact, Roosevelt had to send in the National Guard to end the conflict, and it left 25 African Americans dead. So while they were starting to improve their situation, they're leaving bad economic times in the South, they're coming to the North for good jobs. They're really faced by racism and discrimination that prevents them to go. Not only do you have discrimination, but you have a series of tensions as well. The best example of this, and famous example, is the Zoot Suit riots. And a Zoot Suit is a piece of clothing. It's a suit. It's the name of the suit. And you can see these are all examples of Zoot Suits right here, where you have baggy pants, super long jacket. And it's a style of clothing that really was pioneered in the West and worn primarily by Mexican Americans. And the suit was a way to protest or show the rebellion of American culture. And so in 1943, 11 sailors reported that they were attacked by Zoot Suit wearing Mexicans. No one knows if this is true or not. It very well could be, but it may be false as well. And so people from all over the cities, when they heard that these sailors who fought in the war were attacked by Mexicans, poured into the segregated parts of the city. Remember, at this time, cities are very segregated all over the country, not only between whites and blacks, but between whites, blacks, Hispanics, Asians, you name it. And they started taking Mexican Americans, young men who were in Zoot Suits, and beating them up. And it became a series of riots, and the riots lasted almost a week. And as you can see here, this is the post from the actual article from the Washington Post, where it talks about how the Zoot Suits were basically like a series of riots around the city in near anarchy that the city could barely control. So not only do you have a lot of people moving at this time, they're trying to better the situation, but in doing so, you have a lot of tension and discrimination that causes violence all over, primarily the North and the West, where these minorities are moving. So the last bit of social change is Japanese internment. Japanese internment is the term for when Japanese Americans were forced to relocate to camps in 1942 for the war. And so what happens, to give you some history, is after Pearl Harbor, there were a series of false reports surfaced that the Japanese were poisoning vegetables and spying for Japan. Now, most Japanese lived on the West Coast here, or in Hawaii. And so that's where most of American vegetables at this time were created. So the thought was, if they're poisoning our food supply, then we are in trouble. So in early 1942, the War Department ordered that the Japanese evacuate Hawaii. And the general in Hawaii actually ignored this, because they made up almost, one-third, even more than one-third of the island. And they knew that if the Japanese left, there wouldn't be enough people to sustain the economy of Hawaii, which was vital considering Pearl Harbor's there, the biggest naval base that was just bombed. It needed rebuilding. It needed staff to care after soldiers and sailors and everyone else who was stationed there. So that's the backdrop. You have people who are very concerned about Japanese after Pearl Harbor. So because of this, only 1,400 people, or about 1% of the Japanese Hawaiians, were removed and put in a camp in Hawaii. The rest stayed. But the people on the West Coast were still very fearful. And so on February 19th, FDR signed an order requiring people of Japanese ancestry from California, parts of Washington, Oregon, New Mexico, and Arizona to vacate their house, leave their belongings, and move to these camps. And these camps were forced labor camps. We make a big deal about what Hitler did, and he was completely wrong by killing them. But we did something similar too in the United States. We forced these Japanese to move out of their house, leave all of their possessions, be stripped of everything they worked for the fear that they had something in common with a country that bombed us. And so it ended up forcing 110,000 Japanese to move. Most of them, is important to know, that they are born in America. Some of them are distant Japanese, their grandparents were even born here, but because they were of Japanese descent, they forced to move. And because of this, they lost all their property, and no charges were ever brought against the Japanese for spying and whatnot. And in fact, if you remember from our other videos, many Japanese served the war and were some of the most decorated soldiers of the war. They translated for the army, they served in the front lines where they were fighting Japan to translate directly what the commanders were saying, so they would be the first men in. They fought in high numbers in the army, but again, they were still subjugated to this discrimination. So after the war happens, they're released, they can go back home. And Korematsu is a Japanese man who was forced into internment. And in 1944, that's 1944, he brought this case to the Supreme Court to say, is it justified that the United States government put us in these camps? And the Supreme Court actually ruled that it is justified because it was on the basis of national security. And when we're in a time of war, the people have less rights. And this idea has stuck, which is why this is a very important case. You should know this case, Korematsu versus the United States. And so then, about 20 years later, in 1965, the Japanese American Citizens League actually got the U.S. government to pay survivors $38 million to repay them for the losses that they occurred. Even though, it's a good start, but that's only 1/10 of their losses that were 20 years ago. So most people had already started to make it back or try, but at least it's something. And then finally, Ronald Reagan gave full reparations when he was president by giving each survivor $20,000. The fact is that many had died at this point and were unable to get it because you had to be the survivor. But nonetheless, at least in the 80s, 40 years later, the government realized its wrongs and tried to help out as best as they could. So, quick review. What are the economic and social changes? Well, economic, the industry is booming at this time for the first time in 15 years. It's virtual unemployment, and people are saving and making more. Social changes, you have a ton of African Americans moving from the South to the West and the North for jobs. At the same time, you have people that are very racist. There's a lot of discrimination, which leads to violence, especially in the cities of the North and the West. The violence was primarily against African Americans and Mexican Americans. Then you have Japanese internment, kind of a very dark hour in American history where the government forced Japanese Americans of all ancestries, whether you were born in Japan or in America, into basically labor camps. They had to leave all their belongings at home for the fear that they were spying for Japan and trying to poison the United States food supply. So that's it. Until next time, Husky historians.